Thanks to you all for braving the weather to come and listen to this talk for 20 minutes. So I'm going to divide my 20 minutes into 5 parts to address this question of how conversational are conversational technologies. If I'm going to answer this question about how conversational technologies are, I need to start to tell you, first of all, about why it is that I'm interested in this question, what it is that I, as a conversation analyst, might have to say about this question and why I feel like it's an important one to address. So I'm going to start by talking about what conversation analysis actually is, this strange field that you may or may not have heard of, but that I've been dedicating my career to for the last 30 years. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how and where conversation is leveraged. So not just in technology, so we'll get to technology, but what are the other products and services and objects and artifacts where conversation finds their way into them in ways that we might not have thought about before? And also, what can we immediately start to realize when we think about where conversation is leveraged in other domains that might be relevant to understanding and addressing the question of this lecture? And so then I'm going to think briefly about what does it actually mean to be conversational? And my examples are going to come from a really basic type of action that we do in our interactions all the time, which is to make a request. So I'm going to give you some examples of people making a request and then sort of try to bring all of that together to think about what the problems are with conversational technologies, what the moonshots for the future might be, and then finish by actually answering the question that I posed at the start. So, what is conversation analysis? Conversation analysis is a field of research. It's 6 decades of cumulative science. It started in sociology, probably as a bit of a critique of sociology. And although it's often regarded as a research method, it's actually much more than a research method because it's a theory of, as well as a method for studying human sociality. And the unique selling point of conversation analysis is that it investigates social interaction in the wild. So not role-played, not simulated, not the sorts of conversations that happen in a laboratory. We don't ask people later to report on their interactions or their conversations in a survey or an interview or a focus group. We look at actual interaction as it happens with the real stakes, the real contingencies that are at play in the wild. And so our primary data are recordings, sometimes single cases, tens, hundreds, or even thousands of audio or video recordings. And then we transcribe them using a system that you'll see illustrated a bit later. A technical system. It's a universal system that allows you to show on the page not just the words that people say, but the way that they say them, the intonation, all the gestures that accompany them, the pace at which they do things, where things happen in overlap, all of those kinds of things that are not just irrelevant detail, but they are all the things that we're actually attending to when we talk to each other. We're always attending to details, even if we're not really thinking about it. So my work, alongside describing what we might think of as the fundamental machinery through which social life happens, which is social interaction, in the sort of second phase of my career, I suppose I focused on identifying, describing, and sharing what we might think of as effective and less effective communication practices. So, for example, some of the most interesting and sort of poignant work that I've done is look at suicide crisis negotiations. These are recordings that might last hours. A police negotiator is talking to somebody who is threatening to end their life. And all the way along this conversation, the practitioner, the negotiator, is doing things that help both parties come to a safe outcome. And what's really interesting is that some of those things that the practitioners are doing them, and they're doing them with expertise and experience, they're not identified and described and shared and written down anywhere. When you look at what's in the training, it's possibly nothing like what we actually see in practice. So those kinds of bringing together of the kind of the rhetoric, the training, the manuals and so on, and then the reality of what experts are actually doing seems quite important to me to actually be able to pin down. And so this gives you a sense of where and how conversation might be leveraged. So around about 2008, I started to develop training types of methods and techniques based on my research that was identifying what works in interaction. And because I was interested in communication training, in parallel, I got interested in communication training itself. And how do people typically train to develop their communication skills. And almost always it happens through role play, simulation. And so I then started to get interested in the question, does role-played encounter, a role-played conversation, look anything like the actual encounter? Because I've studied the actual encounters. Let's have a look at the role-play. And I suppose the answer to that question is that role-plays look quite different to the real thing. And yet people often have their communication skills assessed through role-play. And so this immediately should start to beg lots of questions. But one reason that this really matters, I think, for thinking about conversational technology and all these other kind of products like training and assessment and so on, is that it often shows you, if you look at something that people are using to assess people's communication, it shows you what we think good is and how we think people talk. But actually, it isn't necessarily what good is, and it isn't how people talk. And yet those ideas about how communication works filter their way into conversational products, including technology. So what does it mean to be conversational? Conversational is a word in the dictionary. It first appeared in the OED in 1799, so it's very old. It lingered at the bottom of the word usage rankings for a long time until maybe the 60s. The definition is ready to converse, addicted to conversation, gifted with the powers of conversation, or of, or belonging to, or proper to conversation. Of course, its more current use, the thing that you're probably more familiar with, are the synonyms around informal, chatty, relaxed, casual, colloquial, idiomatic. That's what we tend to think of when we think about what conversational means. But for me, as a conversation analyst, I think I would approach the definition a bit differently and think, well, human beings can't interact with each other in either speech or writing or any modality without being conversational, since for us it refers to the machinery through which social interaction happens. So I started to think about this in more detail and how it might apply to things like technology in the context of tech in 2018, when I went and worked as an industry fellow at Typeform. And many of you will have filled in a Typeform probably without even knowing that it was a Typeform. So they're an online data collection product. And so when it comes to technology, conversational, again, generally refers to the interaction being somewhat informal, connected to a persona or a tone of voice, and implemented by things like exclamation marks, emojis, informalities, contracted grammar, that kind of thing. Typeform's aim as its USP as a startup was to turn boring forms into delightful experiences through which you collect data one at a time through questions, because that's how conversation works. So this is an example of a form. This happens to be a form which a health visitor might use, and this is research conducted by John Heritage, a conversation analyst in UCLA. And he was interested in this form. It's the kind of form that Typeform wanted to avoid people having to fill in, so they were sort of making these conversational forms. And so when I started at Typeform, I thought, I need to unpack what conversational might mean, and I immediately thought about this study. So for me, conversational is not about informality and tone of voice and emojis, but actually thinking about how do people turn this form into conversation? Because actually, sometimes people need to talk like a form, or they need to collect information. And so one of the really interesting things about this form is that it was contrasted by the researcher with the conversation that the health visitor actually had with a new parent to complete the form. And so, for example, you can see there on the form, the birth information that you're meant to record says pregnancy, abnormal, specify. But in the conversation, the health visitor says, and she has a normal pregnancy? And then another item on the form is type of delivery, fill in the answer. And then in the conversation, it's and a normal delivery. And so you can start to see that there's a conversational piece here, which is that humans have the job all the time of turning all sorts of stuff into conversation. Did they do it effectively? Can we identify what they're doing? So here's an example of what a Typeform, conversational analytic inspired Typeform might start to look like. So in a data collection survey tool, we might have what's your name, and then typically you might have what's your email address. But one of the things that we did was think about, okay, these are a connection of actions that we need to sort of bring together and show how you would do this if you were actually doing it in a conversation. And so typically what you would do is say, what's your name and your email? And so just changing the design of that question from what's your email to and your email immediately makes it conversational from my point of view. And there isn't an emoji or an exclamation mark in sight. However, there is more than one way to ask for anything, including email. And we're going to look at that now. So conversation analysis is the analysis of action in interaction. How do people, in this case, make a request and ask each other for things? And so I'm going to show you some examples, 2 ways here in which service providers ask their service users for their email address. And so the first one is very similar to the Typeform conversation analytic augmented example where we turn it into this and preface question that connects it to a sequence of things that you're doing in the interaction. And so here, this is just a service provider saying to the person on the phone in this case, and what's your email address? And the client comes back. There's all sorts of technical squiggles and things in the transcript. Don't worry about that. But the caller says, there's a tut, and then there's an and then there's a breath, and then she says, Suze Anderson @ and then continues to give her email address. So this way of asking has a presupposition in it that the person being asked has and uses email and that it's not a problem to respond to it. And your email is, and you just give the email. But let's see another way of asking for email. And I want you to imagine that we're going to get rid of this presupposition. And imagine that either you're the service provider or maybe you're the Typeform, and something about the conversation that you've had so far has led you to pick up that maybe this isn't the way to ask for email. And so I'm going to play you a clip. This is from a holiday sales company. You can follow it through. The audio is anonymized, and you'll just see the different way in which this email address is asked for.
So just in case you get cut off, what's the best contact number for yourself? 012. Yeah. Yeah. That is lovely. And do you have an email address at all, Darren? No, I don't. That's okay. It's more trouble than it's worth, isn't it? That's no problem.
Okay, so there's lots of things that I find very interesting here, but I wonder if you noticed that in response to the first question, the one that comes before the email, the best contact number for yourself, and although I've anonymized most of the number, the caller starts by saying 012. Now, if you know what 012 means and you're listening and you're not just asking the same questions to everybody in the same way all the time, you should be picking up that this is not a mobile phone number. That would start 07. And so it's so gorgeous here that this particular call taker hears 01 and then doesn't say at line 5, for example, and your email. In fact, she does a different design. She takes away the presupposition that the caller has email and makes it easy for the caller to actually say she doesn't have email. Do you have email address there at all? It's designed for a no. It takes away the presupposition that you're just going to supply the email. And this is what we call recipient design. And this is one of the huge challenges for conversational tech, because as soon as you start to design a script, a chatbot, and all of the things that infiltrate and find their way into conversations, they're simply not this agile. They're not able to pick up things like, or even if they did it once, just because one person said 012 doesn't necessarily mean that you should definitely ask about their email this way. You're actually picking up like everything that someone is saying in order to design your requests. Okay, a couple more examples before we finish. So how about requesting a lift because your car's broken down? So here is just the opening of a call. It's a classic call in my field. It's called stalled. And basically, it's the first part of a request that never surfaces as a request. So how do you ask for a lift if your car is broken down? You might imagine that you phone your friend and say, my car's broken down, can I have a lift? But actually, we very often do not make requests by making requests. In fact, what we do is we describe a problem and we hope that an offer comes, because actually we prefer to get offers than have to make requests. So this is just the start of a call between Marcia and Donnie. And we'll just get to the point where Donnie makes the pre-announcement, the news, and kind of what we would hope might happen next is that Marcia would offer to come and give him a ride or help him out. It turns out actually that Marcia, so Donnie never asks for a lift, and Marcia never says that she can't give him a lift. Instead, she says, oh, I've got to go out in 5 minutes, which, does the business of saying I can't come and give you a lift. But let's have a look at it.
My car is stopped.
Okay, now I'll say something about that in a minute, but what I now want to show you is what ChatGPT makes of this scenario. So I'm going to play you the same call, but this time we have fed ChatGPT everything that Donnie says, and ChatGPT we got with great difficulty and lots of prompting to role play Marsha. And so just to make it more interesting for you, I've converted, this was all of course written, but I've converted ChatGPT Marsha's turns into speech via text to speech. So here it comes.
This is Marsha speaking. How may I assist you?
Hi, Donnie.
How can I assist you? Is there something specific you need help with?
That's right.
Oh, I'm not very good at guessing games, but I'll give it a try. Did you win a contest or receive some good news?
My car is stopped.
Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. Donnie, that must be frustrating. Are you in a safe location? Is there anything I can do to help?
And then it keeps going on and on. The original call takes less than 30 seconds. The ChatGPT version takes 3 minutes. And this is an urgent call. We can kind of see from the opening from the original call that Donnie is rushing, he's breathy, he's overlapping, it's urgent. That's how you do urgency. So 3 minutes for ChatGPT to get to the end. And here's the end.
You're welcome, Donnie. I'm here to help. If you need any further assistance, don't hesitate to reach out. Take care, and I wish you the best. Goodbye.
Okay. So a couple of, we could spend, we haven't got long enough to sort of really take apart these two transcripts. But the first thing that we see is of course the time difference. The second thing is that ChatGPT isn't doing what we just saw, that holiday salesperson talking, which is quickly coming to understand who is Donnie to me, what is this situation, and instead tends to treat everybody like the same kind of service user rather than a friend or acquaintance, and can't nimbly change for recipients. And then, of course, one other thing that I just want you to notice, and you probably couldn't fail to notice, is the constant use of Donnie's name in ChatGPT. And I find this super interesting because one of the first things that I discovered when I got to Typeform is that typically the Typeform used to start at least with what's your first name and your surname. And of course, if these systems get your first name, they can then pipe it into the conversation and it feels personalized. I remember saying something like, you're way over piping the names, stop putting the names everywhere because it really doesn't do what you think it does. It's personal maybe once in the right place, but not all the time. But this is interesting again because salespeople, and again I have lots of sales calls to show this, are trained partly to use people's names, and they tend to use them too much in the wrong place, compared to going back to actually the police negotiations where the use of somebody's name when they're in a crisis of a suicidal type is actually incredibly important to get right. So the idea that you just stick people's names everywhere, that'll build rapport and make people feel good, you can just see how problematic it is. But also, this is taking me back to where we started, which is, if we don't really understand conversation, how can we build an assessment tool? And better yet, how can we even think about building conversational technologies? So to finish, I want to show us one more request. And I want you to just think about this question of how can we design conversational systems if we don't know what real talk is like, if we don't look at it, if we don't know about conversation analysis, if we don't write it down, if we don't describe what is effective from the resource that is all around us, which is human sociality. So take the request of asking for a pizza, and I'm just going to show you two contexts in which people are asking for a pizza for delivery. This is first one, smartphone.
I'd like to order a pizza for delivery.
Okay, here's what I found.
Okay, so it's fairly straightforward. Here's the places that you can get a takeaway pizza. Now I'm going to play you a different place in which someone would like to order a pizza for delivery.
911, operator 911, where's the emergency?
127 Premier.
Okay, what's going on there?
I'd like to order a pizza for delivery.
Ma'am, you've reached 911. This is an emergency line.
Large with half pepperoni, half mushroom.
You've called 911. This is an emergency line.
How long it'll be?
We don't have time, and I won't insult you by showing you what ChatGPT makes of this conversation, but it doesn't go where the real one ends up, which is that the human call taker is picking up on things already to know that this is a genuine request from a victim of domestic violence who can't use the words of, I need urgent assistance because my life is in danger, and instead needs to sound like they're talking to pizza. And the human call taker starts to pick up and starts to ask yes/no questions, and the urgent assistance is provided. And when we start to look at other cases like this, so I've got some British data for comparison as well, what we see is that it's not, you can't just say, well, someone phones pizza and it's the police, so the police will definitely hear that because it's the police. The context will tell you that this means it's genuine. That isn't what happens at all, because lots of people call the police for non-genuine reasons. It's not urgent, they're unwell, whatever it might be. Calling the police and asking for pizza doesn't mean that it will always be heard as a genuine request. And actually, some of the things that the call takers seem to be picking up on, because we see this across when we compare other data sets and also calls which we're not really sure what's going on, but it is somewhere between a nuisance, malicious, or just not the right environment. It's what I've highlighted there in purple at 15 and 23, which is that the caller talks in overlap, which is very difficult to do with conversational user interfaces because they only understand one type of bargain, which is to stop it producing, the wrong thing that you've just asked Alexa for, and you have to sort of stop it, and that's the only thing it can do. It can't understand that if you place turns halfway through somebody else's turn, that seems to be the tacit thing that people are doing to convey, I want you to hear that I'm pretending to talk to pizza, but I'm actually really in danger. People who are doing a different type of non-urgent call tend not to use those turn incursions. So what does all this mean? My concluding couple of sentences. I really love the idea from Emily Bender and colleagues of large language models as stochastic parrots, which basically they're sort of parroting back statistical patterns that they've learned from large data sets of a particular type, full of biases, all the things that we're discovering all the time about these LLMs. But they're not really, they're good at generating something that looks like conversation, but they're not actually very good across a sequence of immediately sort of doing all of the responsive work that humans do to progress it and understand it and have the outcome that is relevant there. And then the other thing is to think about NLP itself. So natural language processing is something that is very, of course, heavily connected into large language models, and the two things sort of go together. But natural language processing provides the resources for understanding natural language, but not for understanding and sort of leveraging action. Because if a request for something that it needs to be articulated with using none of the words that you would typically associate with a request, then if you don't really understand that people will build actions without using all the obvious words, and I don't just mean the pizza case, I mean things like, my car is stalled, and that is a request, then we won't be able to build really great conversational technologies. So, to finish, how conversational are conversational technologies? Well, maybe they're as conversational as some of those other products that leverage conversation, because there's lots of places where we might need to sort of build some of this science into product development, including conversational tech. And I'll stop there.